Greetings, you wonderful mutants. It's me, Joel Clark, lead designer of Lone Wolf Fist. Doing chapter 4 still. And I keep stubbing my toe on this stupid chapter. There's a reason for it. This was a very important chapter in the original writing back in, what was it, December or January, when I was really, doing the push to get this out. And it's a chapter that was boiling for a long time. A lot of systems that I was hinting at were eventually going to point at this chapter. And it's went through a couple of iterations. I've had a weird relationship with the montage scene rules because they're at an awkward place in the rules. They're at the place where you have to artificially say, okay, now we're going to stop this game and start this other game. And it goes from the, working in real time and talking when your character talks and rolling dice when your character acts. It goes from that into this much more removed and abstract game where it's like, okay, over the course of several months, my character is going to apply their effort consistently to do this thing. And that's that demarcating point is awkward for a couple of reasons. The first reason, of course, is it's weird to shift gears like that, right? We expect naturally, as players, that the rules we are using are things that are kind of real in their manifestation to characters. And so whenever you abandon the set of abstractions that we've agreed upon for how they interact with the world and substitute a different set of abstractions, we naturally compare those two sets. And if the second set, in this case, a broader, more general, more time uncompressed, it's a time decompressed, set of principles, isn't a natural and logical outgrowth of the first set of principles, which are very time compressed, very specific and constrained. If we see that second set of principles and they don't match, if they don't grow out of that one in a way that kind of agrees with our intuition, it's very jarring. For example, my first few initial drafts of this, which I don't even know if these saw any release, but my first few initial drafts of these was you would roll dice and make sets in scenes, and they could get really high, and there was no limiter to them. And then, when you went to the political scenes, where you could actually make really big setting changes, when you got to, the domain turns, everything would tone down enormously. You would roll dice one time, and that would be it. It would result in the capacity to get much smaller. There was a lot more restrictions in those scenes, because I didn't want big setting changes to happen as soon as you took some time off. Because what I didn't want to happen was a game that was played passively. And this is actually a core problem to how these things work. The problem that you get is that it makes sense that if you are, powerful in a normal scene, then any scene in which you aren't under the constraints of time or anyone trying to punch you or anything, you should be in plus X powerful, which is larger. X should be a positive value. You can tell I've been nerding out about pre-calculus lately. But you should have a larger value, right? You should be able to do more because you don't have any restraints of time. You can roll as many times as you want and get the highest set that you want. You can save stuff in your focus like you'd be able to do, in a slower scene. And you can spend an effectively unlimited amount of prana. So it makes sense that in that second, more relaxed scene, you'd have way more power. Except the problem with that is that if you have a lot more power and the ability to change the setting with a lot more power in those slower scenes, then you would always want to go into them. And if there's nothing keeping you from going into them, then the game is almost completely played passively, So I didn't want that. I didn't want to incentivize people to get into those passive scenes and not play the amazing crawl around through the post-apocalypse punch monsters to death game that I really wanted. I didn't want just an abstract political board game. So the challenge for me became thinking of reasons why that second state wouldn't be the default. Because in games like Exalted, it was. In Exalted Second Ed, they came to that and they were just like, yeah, that's fine. And they didn't think about the effect that might have on gameplay or on incentivizing player action. So I had to solve that issue. And I think I did. Because really that structure makes sense in the real world too. if we're not at war, if any culture isn't at war, suddenly they have a dearth of free time on their hands, and they don't have to worry about somebody killing them. And so they apply themselves to industry. At least theoretically. I mean, like, yes, granted, World War II got the United States out of the Great Depression, but, like, I don't know. I've researched that a lot, and I don't know how much it was World War II and how much it was the Great Depression just kind of petering out after a certain amount of time. Like, so the point I guess I'm making is that if you're not at war, if you're not under time constraint, if you're not at war, then the natural thing to do is for capable people and organizations, or at least those organizations and people that have a pile of resources and authority, to kind of direct them to make as much more resources and power for themselves as possible. And that's kind of what I wanted to model, like this sort of anarchic pseudo-feudal thing. Especially with the post-apocalypse. Like, the post-apocalypse is very frequently used as a critique of our modern resource management. And it's a reasonably good critique, I think. But I wasn't interested in it as a critique. I'm mostly interested in it as, like, a tactical exercise. I think it's really fun that you can play a role-playing game where you're punching monsters in the post-apocalypse, and you can happen upon, like, a gold mine. And then an industrious player can be like, well, wait a minute. We could either save this gold mining town, or we could just conquer it. There's really nothing saying that we shouldn't be in charge here. Then we have the gold. And what if we use the gold to, like, buy things and, like, try to increase our wealth? The benefit of that kind of paradigm, especially if your game is designed to actually make it meaningful, is that it generates its own dramatic arcs. It generates its own characters that are interested in the gold, that make natural villains. It generates natural problems that might be happening. There's monsters in the bottom of the cave. We've delved too greedily and too deep. We need some magical punch guys to punch them for us. You know you want to fist fight a Balrog? Come on, dude. So, like, it naturally generates that stuff. Like, you barely have to work at it. And having what is effectively a node of interest that the players are emotionally invested in that generates content for your game, mwah, it's a gold mine in more than one sense, right? And so I wanted that. But I don't want a game that's played passively. And I certainly don't want a game that doesn't think about the consequences that might have, or the natural consequences that might have. Case in point, a lot of later editions of D&D, 3rd edition and on, they just don't have anything for that. Like, at all, really. They don't think about the economy. They don't think about how people operate in a society. They don't think about the consequences of these, what are effectively medieval superheroes, because the power level in 3rd edition and beyond is ridiculous. But, like, they don't think what's going to happen if those characters, say, want to be a king, or have a keep, or have a society that they're in charge of. They don't understand it, and they're not interested in it. They really want these super powerful beings to keep going into dungeons and getting gold, and there's no real concept of there being a consequence for that. So it becomes this hollow, unsatisfying exercise at a certain point, where it's like, this isn't mapped to any kind of reality. People don't work like this. And even the fantasy analogs of people don't really work like this. So that's really frustrating. So we come to the 4th chapter, Domains, where I have a bunch of issues, where I'm like, okay, I want this stuff, but here's the problems that I have. And I wrote it. And it was really hard, and it took several years of thinking about this stuff, and very carefully deciding on limiting things and challenges and mechanisms that get put into it. And ultimately, I feel like I might have designed it a little bit reactively. I've been picking through other role-playing games recently, because at this point, my game's designed. I can let myself breathe and not feel like I'm being tainted by someone else's ideas whenever I'm designing something of my own. I can actually just take it in and enjoy it. You know, like, oh, this is a cool novel idea. I didn't think about this, but it's neat. And I think a lot of those systems, like, they start with a set of principles, and then from there, they're like, okay, this is as far as those principles go, so that's the game we're going to have. And I think that's a clever way of doing it. My way was a little bit more like just looking at the world and looking at what I wanted and seeing, like, okay, where's the compromise that I can communicate and turn into a gameable system? And I did that. I actually did write that. The problem was, I wrote it in kind of a stream of consciousness. And every time I thought of a new element that kind of rustled my little wagon, I would just tack it on. So you have this chapter that starts off talking about montages, right? Which were scenes where I decided was going to be the demarcating point between playing in a concrete style and playing in a more abstract style. They're like, a little bit past the skip scenes. They're like the training montages and things like that. And then it goes into, without a lot of fanfare, talking about domain management mechanics. And then it kind of just swings around between these different elements of that, where it's like, okay, here's what resources are, and here's how populaces work, and here's the method of commanding different things, and here's this, and here's that. And there's no real rhyme or reason to it. And the different parts do work together, but it's not clear. Like, their relationship isn't entirely clear whenever you're reading through it. There's no real flowchart that says, okay, to fill out a domain sheet, do these steps. That needs to be there. I need to see a domain sheet, and I need a sequence of steps to go through to fill it out. I gave you that for characters, and domains are even more abstract and less intuitive. I need that for this. I always knew I was going to make domain sheets, but they're not there right now. Now that I'm looking at the laid out chapter and I'm reading it, I'm not getting an intuitive sense for how it works. So what I'm doing, and this is going to probably go on to maybe 20 minutes, sorry about that, guys, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to take the chapter and say, and evaluate the individual chunks of it right now and say, okay, what is this trying to say? What is the message this is communicating? And adding enough text and enough clarity to make each individual chunk work like that. Then what I'm going to do is, and I'm doing this now actually, sequencing the ideas and saying, okay, here's what I say first, and then I concretely conclude that part. Here's what I say next, and then I concretely conclude that part. Right now, the kind of stream of consciousness style that I wrote about the middle third of the chapter in, it blends together ideas in a messy way that's hard to parse. So I'm trying to more concretely conclude each part and make it less reliant on the next part of writing that's coming up. It's a weakness I've had with my style, I find. And once I do that, once I sequence the ideas, it's going to be a lot more clean. I've sketched out, I actually went back to Blood from God's Eye, and I was like, okay, if I was going to domain manage this, if I was going to turn the raw stuff from here, because this is an early version of how I do content for this game. Before I wrote the content chapter in Chapter 3, I was like, how should this look? What's a tract? What's a field? How do you move between them? And the alpha version of that is in Blood from God's Eye. You can actually see discrete tracts that have fields in them, and you move between them. Like, that's how it should work in the game, or an early version of how it should work. It's a little more concrete now, but it's reasonably concrete here. Like, a field is a content area you interact with, and then moving between those fields, there's this kind of like this skip scene that's right there, where it's like, I'm having an action scene, or I'm having a real-timer action scene in a field, and then when I move from that field to an adjacent field, we do a brief skip scene that moves over the travel time, or any boring part of the travel time. And it can get interrupted, and if it gets interrupted, then we can make like, a field based on the surrounding tracks information. That's it. So there's a sequence. There's like this clear, planned, here's what you do sequence that you can go through. And it's really, really nice. But what I didn't do with that was I didn't further go and say, okay, if they decide to take over Luckless Schwann's Golden Fort, or like conquer something, here's how they write the political borders of these places. But I can do that now. I've got Chapter 4, and even though the rules aren't super great for teaching someone else how to do them right now, they're fine for me because I know how it's all supposed to fit together. So I did. I went to Blood from God's Eye, and I generated a random character. I turned to be a Shadow Viper named like Patch's Knives, or Patch Knives was his name. That was the random generated name I made for him. So good old Patch Knives. But Patch Knives I decided the little mini story I'd be like, he was a lieutenant of Flesh-Eating Sage. He went and killed Luckless Schwann, and then was immediately like, but you know what? You know what? If you follow me, we can kill Flesh-Eating Sage, and then we'll be free forever. So I just took everyone in that tract, good and bad, and I was like, okay, they all swear allegiance to him. What does he have? And I was like, okay, that's a good question. If I were a GM and I was tasked with turning this into a tract for a player who just pulled these shenanigans and managed to pull it off, what would it look like? What would their forces be? What would their populaces be? Would I need to key their populaces to individual fields? What resources would they have? How would I figure out how many there were? Where would they be? Would it be important to transport those resources between fields? Like, in all those questions that I was having, those were really high value questions because they got me thinking about it like, okay, if I were going to set this up, what information would I need? And I made a little list of those things. So there's going to be another draft of this chapter with post-editing, which is a terrible idea. Don't do that. But there is going to be another draft of this chapter that has a modicum of new writing in it. And that modicum of new writing is going to be the really important writing that tells you how to use all the rules in here in the content that I told you how to set up for in the previous chapter, in Chapter 3, Game Mastery. So now you should be able, with this new writing and this new layout and everything, you should be very, very capable of thinking of an idea for a game, making content for it as a GM, having your players make characters for it, all that perfectly works together, and then if you want to early, you can, or if you don't want to early, it doesn't matter, or if your players want to later, you can then retroactively go and look at what you've made and what you've written down in your notes and say, okay, here's how you turn that into a domain, and here's how that domain works. And it's a very simple bolt-on layer of additional content that winds up being purely optional, because you don't have to do that stuff. You never have to do the domain rules. It's fun to do them. I love them. They're one of my favorite parts of this game, one of the pieces of writing I'm most proud of. But you don't have to. Now you can just do adventures forever if you're that kind of gamer. I know, right? I'm stoked about it. I told you it'd take 20 minutes. Anyway, but I wanted to make sure I was getting on here and telling you guys, like, okay, well, it's September. We're dragging through another year. Why is this taking so long? Well, it needs to work. The other chapters shouldn't be too terrible. But, yeah, this weekend, which is to say tomorrow after I get off work and the 2 days after that, this weekend is going to be my big layout and finalizing Chapter 4 push. What that should get me, if I'm able to really hammer down, because I think I might actually retire Chapter 4 for a little bit and just work on the layout just so it gets done. But what that should get me is Chapter 5, 6, and 7 laid out and looking nice with their art and everything. I'm waiting on some art from Kazuki, but aside from that, it should be completely done. And once those are done, the only things left, let me pluralize that, is finishing up Chapter 4, doing a final proofread and filling in all the page XXs, doing... Oh, shit, you know what I forgot? I forgot the appendices. Crap. Okay. And appendices, because I gotta do all the backer stuff. I keep forgetting about that. So I'm sorry, the fourth chapter has been eating my brain. It's a challenging chapter. But okay, do that too. But it should be the layout of everything but the appendices, and the very last of Chapter 4. So index, page XX, appendices, and then I just got to make sure it's all in one document and formatted in a nice, readable way. And it has its sheets, its character sheet, which I need to redo. It needs to have the character sheet. It needs to have the domain sheet. I think I need a vehicle sheet was one of the other ones. And I think there was also a followers sheet. I think those are all of them. Again, I'll make certain that the sheets that need to be in there to make the game run are all in the back right after the appendices. And then I think we're golden. I think that once that is formatted into PDF that DriveThruRPG will actually accept, I'm going to put it up for sale there, and then the backers will all get their copies. I'll send out the surveys. We'll all get the PDF copies. And then the only thing left to do after that is I need to do the proofs and formatting for the formatting, then the proofs, and then I need to print off and make sure I've got the hardback from their print-on-demand service. Now, before I leave here, I want to make sure I'm making this clear. I still have enough money in my little Kickstarter pile to make sure that all of the print-on-demands are free of cost for backers who paid for them. Obviously, you don't have to pay for them twice. That's what the Kickstarter funds were for. But, importantly, I don't have the shipping costs for them. I made sure that was an element of the Kickstarter. So, some of y'all might have some pretty big shipping costs. If you have a shipping cost and it's like really onerous, email me and I'll talk to DriveThruRPG about it and see if we can't do a workaround. It might be easiest for me to just print them off and ship them here and then ship them to you. That might be a lower cost overall. Or it might be something where I can absorb part of the cost. I don't want to do that. I'd like to make some profit off this Kickstarter. But if my first Kickstarter winds up costing me money, it's not gonna kill me, you know? So that's just make sure y'all know that, like, what's going to happen is I don't have physical books. A $2,000 Kickstarter couldn't get that. It was a $20,000 that would have got that, but that failed. So $2,000 Kickstarter, which wound up being $4,000. Nice. I can do print on demand from DriveThruRPG. Like, that's the level I'm operating at. I don't want there to be unrealistic expectations there. Just because I don't want anyone to be upset by this. I want people to have their books. I want people to be able to play the game. But I have to operate within my means. And right now, I'm still a complete rank amateur. And, yeah. Anyway, so that's our video update. I guess I don't have to write anything if y'all are actually going to watch this, so that's cool. I wish I had more art for my updates. Kazuki's dragging his feet this time. The stuff looks good so far. The returns look nice. But he's going through it, so it might be another week or two before I see some really good stuff for the Armory. Okay, so it was 21-ish minutes. That's not too bad. Thanks for listening to my big spiel. I'm going to get to doing layout for the next hour before work, and hopefully we get like the layout done for these last 3 chapters over the next couple of days, and then we can push into those very, very final parts of it. Here's hoping, folks. We're on the last leg.